In a 1962 conversation with French director François Truffaut, Alfred Hitchcock called his 1927 silent film The Lodger the first true Hitchcock movie. Of course, it opens with a screaming blonde. The Lodger was adapted from a novel of the same name by Marie Belloc-Lowndes. It's a Jack the Ripper-style mystery in which a cloaked stranger stalks London, murdering young women. In Lowndes' novel, the killer targets women of ill repute. In Hitchcock's film adaptation, he targets blondes. Thus begins a fixation that would continue throughout Hitchcock's career. According to author Stephen Smith, half of Hitchcock's 53 films feature blonde protagonists. He cast them so often and in such consistent ways that these characters formed an entirely new archetype, the Hitchcock blonde, one that immediately conjures names and images in the mind of any Hitchcock fan. Birds swooping down on Tippi Hedren, Grace Kelly modeling the latest fashions for a wheelchair-bound Jimmy Stewart, Eva Marie Saint hanging off the side of Mount Rushmore, Janet Leigh screaming in the shower, Kim Novak emerging from the glow of the Empire Hotel's lights. Although The Lodger established Alfred Hitchcock's fixation on blondes, it took a while for the Hitchcock blonde to become a recognizable stereotype. In interviews later in his career, Hitchcock was often quite candid about roles he felt were miscast or films that he felt fell short, often because they were handed to him directly by a studio or a producer. He needed time to not only hone his craft as the master of suspense, but also to build a reputation and accumulate the power to cast and execute his films as he pleased, or at least as close to his wishes as censors would allow. So while he considered Madeleine Carroll in The 39 Steps the first Hitchcock blonde, it wasn't until the 1950s, and significantly until after he started consistently working in color, that the perception of Hitchcock as a director who favored blondes truly began to take shape. So what did Hitchcock see in blondness that made this aesthetic a desirable feature for his leading ladies? And if he preferred blondes and used them in a specific way, what about the other women in his films? If by limiting his brunettes to certain roles, did he, by default, also create an archetype for them? Of course, all of these characters are unique in their own ways. The archetypes I discuss have exceptions. But the trends definitely exist, and that's what I intend to explore in today's video. Before we get started, I want to give a huge thanks to Mubi for sponsoring this video. Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/bekindrewind. In 1955, Screenland magazine ran a story titled The Two Grace Kellys. To the press and public, she has often seemed aloof, wrote Tom Burton, yet occasionally they have caught a tantalizing glimpse of a warm, human Grace. Which is the real Kelly? This is the essential tension Alfred Hitchcock liked to explore with his leading ladies, women who appear worldly and sophisticated, whose glamour seems entirely unattainable, but who might just reveal an affectionate, vulnerable, voracious personality, if one were savvy enough to unravel her mysteries. When asked about his taste in leading ladies, Hitchcock gave a consistent answer, which, in blunt terms, boiled down to,
"We want a lady in the street, but a freak in the bed that say."
The sensuality of bombshells like Marilyn Monroe and Brigitte Bardot, whose clothes hugged all the right places and who seemed to flirt with every line, didn't interest him. Sexuality so obvious would feel out of place for the master of suspense. Hitchcock's women were crafted to fit into his world of secrets, misdirection, and violence. His leading ladies would be like his films, puzzles to be solved. In a 1962 essay titled Elegance Above Sex, Hitchcock wrote, "I prefer a woman who does not display all of her sex at once, one whose attractions are not falling out in front of her. I like women who are also ladies, who hold enough of themselves in reserve to keep a man intrigued. On the screen, for example, if an actress wants to convey a sexy quality, she ought to maintain a slightly mysterious air." That same year, he put it in more explicit terms in a conversation with François Truffaut. "You know why I favor sophisticated blondes in my films? We are after the drawing room type, the real ladies who become whores in the bedroom. An English girl looking like a school teacher is apt to get into a cab with you, and to your surprise, she'll probably pull a man's pants open." In her biography of frequent Hitchcock collaborator Joan Harrison, Phantom Lady, Christina Lane perfectly describes the director's approach to female characters as a seemingly unending process of withholding and revealing, or a game of hide and seek. First impressions of the Hitchcock blonde almost never turn out to be correct because crucial information is usually withheld from the audience. Take, for example, Eva Marie Saint as Eve Kendall in North by Northwest. The film's protagonist, played by Cary Grant, is on the run from the police. Falsely accused of murder, he sneaks aboard a luxury train where he meets Eve. The attraction is immediate between the two of them as they banter. Eve's dialogue is spare, one-word answers, asking questions, never revealing too much of herself or her true intentions. George believes he's found a kindred spirit, a woman enchanted by his outlaw status and adventurous enough to assist him in his escape. He becomes so enamored, he fails to consider how unbelievably lucky a chance encounter like this might be. No wonder then he is surprised when she turns out to be not just a kindred spirit, but part of the larger plot from which he cannot escape. In To Catch a Thief, Grace Kelly plays Frances, who at first appears the rigid, silent type. When her mother's brazen, drunken flirting with Cary Grant's character finally goes too far, she decides the night is over for the group.
Sorry I ever sent her that finishing school. I think they finished her there.
Come on, Mother.
Having betrayed no sexual interest in him thus far in the night, she nevertheless plants a passionate kiss on him before closing the door. The iceberg has suddenly, unexpectedly, melted before him. How might this strange, beautiful girl surprise him next? Again, her aloof demeanor masks a secret. She knows Grant's character is in disguise, that he's not a timberman from Oregon, but an infamous cat burglar. And she's not only clever enough to piece together the clues, but also deviant enough to find his criminality erotic. Kelly, in my mind, is the quintessential Hitchcock blonde. In her short career, Hitchcock was the only director either perceptive or capable enough to notice the undercurrent of eroticism in her and exploit it. Even the press at the time noted how only Alfred Hitchcock was shrewd enough to see the woman underneath. He directed her in the realistic kissing scenes with Jimmy Stewart in Rear Window and started her off on an entirely different vein. Seduction, as Hitchcock so brusquely explained, was key. Even if he couldn't say or show that these women weren't the type to wait until marriage, he found other unsubtle ways to signal it. That process of withholding Lane wrote about applies not only to the plot machinations that reveal these characters for who they are, but also to the performance style of the Hitchcock blonde. Although these women are broadly strong-willed, passionate, and in many cases brave, they're not played as energetic or vibrant personalities, adding to the impression of them as aloof and sophisticated. They move economically, reduce anything extraneous, simple, streamlined seduction, a storm brewing internally. Eva Marie Saint explained how Hitchcock directed her performance in North by Northwest.
As for what direction he gave her during filming, Saint recalled the following instructions. Lower my voice, don't use my hands, and look directly at Cary Grant in my scenes with him. Look right into his eyes. From that, I conjured up in my mind the kind of lady he saw this woman as.
Kim Novak recalled a similar experience working on Vertigo, with Hitchcock directing her to hold her body a certain way and control the intonation of her voice.
Madeline had the complication and the excitement and energy underneath. It was all very, very held back on the outside, but underneath there were so many things going that I think that's part of what fascinated Jimmy Stewart, caused him a compulsion to want her, to possess her.
There's a reason, for example, that Carole Lombard isn't considered a Hitchcock blonde despite starring in Mr. and Mrs. Smith for Hitchcock. Not only is the film a rare comedy from the director, but her performance style remains all her own, as screwball and zany as anything else she starred in at the time. Hitchcock blondes shared other traits beyond their air of mystery. For one thing, many of them were financially well off. Some hold jobs that situate them in a world of cultural elites. Lisa in Rear Window works in fashion. Joe in The Man Who Knew Too Much is a famous singer. Alicia in Notorious and Eve in North by Northwest are spies recruited to maneuver in upper-class circles. Others are simply members of the idle rich. Melanie's father owns a newspaper in the Birds. Frances in To Catch a Thief is an heiress to an oil fortune. Their wealth means these characters can become mannequins for some of the most beautiful garments ever put to screen. Hitchcock and legendary costume designer Edith Head began working together in 1946 on Notorious and continued their collaboration over the next 30 years on 11 films. Head loved working with Hitchcock because he created such a clear framework for what his leads should and should not wear. Simple shapes, expertly tailored, never too clingy or revealing, nothing so eye-catching that it would drown out the actress. Thirza Wakefield quotes Head in Sight and Sound as saying that working for Hitchcock was an education in restraint. Head herself later wrote, "I was well aware of his feeling about garish colors. He didn't like anything bright unless it made a story point. He preferred nature colors, as he called them, beige, soft greens, and delicate turquoise. He had strong feelings that color should never be so strong that it overpowered the scene or the actress. If the script called for a girl in a red dress, that's one thing, but to put her in a red dress for no reason was out of the question in a Hitchcock film. A character's garments should not only signify class and beauty, but also help underline the unattainable quality and subtle sensuality Hitchcock sought for his leading ladies. For example, here's how Head described costuming Grace Kelly for Rear Window. Hitchcock told me it was important that Grace's clothes help establish some of the conflict in the story. She was to be the typical sophisticated society girl magazine editor who falls in love with a scruffy photographer. He's insecure and thinks that she thinks he isn't good enough for her. Hitch wanted her to look like a piece of Dresden china, something slightly untouchable. So I did that. Her suits were impeccably tailored. Her accessories looked as though they couldn't have been worn by anyone else but her. She was perfect. It's worth noting that the definition Hitchcock gives is particularly true of his leading ladies in the 1950s and beyond. The female protagonists of his films in the 1930s and 40s, Rebecca, Suspicion, and Spellbound, for example, play more active roles in the narrative. In each film, her psychology is foregrounded, as opposed to being framed as something for the male protagonist to investigate and interpret, and the audience joins her on her journey to uncover the truth. The unnamed lead of Rebecca is thrust into the mysterious world of Manderley, where the past haunts the present like a ghost. She must confront what happened there for her marriage to survive. Gregory Peck plays more of a Hitchcock blonde in Spellbound than Ingrid Bergman. She plays a psychoanalyst who must go deep into her lover's psyche to recover his lost memories after a traumatic event. In Suspicion, Joan Fontaine again appears as an inexperienced young woman navigating a new romance. Soon she comes to realize that she may not have known her new lover as well as she thought she did. Is he just a cheat, or is something more malicious going on? As a side note, I recently spoke to Dr. Josephine Botting, a curator at the British Film Institute, about her research on Hitchcock's wife and creative partner, Alma Reville, and we spoke a lot about how Alma and screenwriter Joan Harrison may have influenced the sensitive, complex characterization of women in these earlier films. That interview is available to listen to for free on my Patreon if you'd like to learn more. So, the Hitchcock blonde is broadly characterized as a sophisticated, wealthy woman with an air of mystery, a woman whose voracious sexual appetite is masked by a proper exterior. There's an obvious problem with this archetype though, right? Which is, what does all of this have to do with being blonde, really? It's not as if a blonde woman were exclusively capable of combining those traits. A role like that could be played by anyone with the right skill set. Gene Tierney could play that, Ida Lupino could play that, Deborah Kerr could definitely play that. It would be disingenuous not to point out that clearly Hitchcock personally found blondes more sexually attractive, which influenced his casting decisions quite a bit. But it's also true that Hitchcock wasn't approaching this topic in a vacuum. He wasn't alone in his ideas about blondness in Hollywood. In fact, blonde fetishism goes back thousands of years. In her article, The Politics of Blondness, Amy LaRocca explains how blonde hair, as we know it, formed in Northern Europe about 11,000 years ago. It wasn't the first hair color that people had, so it was rare, and its being rare made it sexually desirable. It became so desirable that ancient civilizations went to great lengths to replicate it, going so far as to rub pigeon shit and horse urine in their hair. light hair with fair skin became a beauty standard for women of status in Western Europe, accepted, even promoted by the church, the state, and the medical community. Marina Warner writes in her book, From the Beast to the Blonde, blondness and beauty have provided a conceptual rhyme in visual and literary imagery since the goddess of love's tresses were described as xanth, golden, by Homer. The color fulfills a symbolic function. It was the imaginary opposite of foul. It connoted all that was pure, good, and clean. We see this conceptual rhyme all over art history and throughout literature. All the blonde angels and saints in Renaissance art, the fairy tale princesses like Rapunzel, even the early Disney princesses leaned heavy on blonde as pure and beautiful. Warner continues, only in the 1930s and 40s, under the influence of Hollywood, did the word blonde emerge as a noun and acquire its hot, vampish overtones, based on the jaunty, ironical reversals of meaning cultivated by popular media in the 20th century. It's this archetype, the pure, good, clean blonde, that Hitchcock would have been interested in weaponizing for the purposes of suspense. When a blonde experiences something harrowing, it's taken more seriously because something good and pure has been tarnished. Michael Walker points out in his book Hitchcock's Motifs, such thinking is not just confined to Hitchcock. Because of the overvaluation of the blonde in popular mythology, it would seem that there's more of a frisson in putting a blonde in danger. In the famous monster films of the early 1930s, for example, the heroine is usually blonde. Helen Chandler in Dracula, Mae Clarke in Frankenstein, Miriam Hopkins in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Fay Wray in King Kong. To be clear, I am in no way personally advocating or endorsing these beauty standards. Rather, I think it's important to step back and recognize how incredibly loaded a term like blonde can be, particularly when it comes to aesthetic ideals. Warner continues, blondness is less a descriptive term about hair pigmentation than a blazon in code, a piece of a value system that it is urgent to confront and analyze because its implications, in moral and social terms, are so dire and are still so unthinkingly embedded in most ordinary popular materials of the imagination. As sociologist Tressie McMillan Cottom put it, when you think of a blonde, you aren't thinking about Beyoncé or Jennifer Lopez, no matter how blonde they are at the moment. It isn't because their hair color is unnatural. Almost all of the world's blondes get that way through chemical intervention. But a blonde is a body with a cultural history of purity, power, and inheritance. When pop culture leverages blonde, it is always as an unmarked racial identity. Blonde is code for white. That code channels oppression and desire, beckoning us only to exclude most of us. Hitchcock may not have used the word white to describe what he looked for in a leading lady, but that is what he meant. After all, he explicitly thought of this subject in terms of ethnicity. Remember that quote about the school teacher who will pull a man's pants down in the back of a cab? This is what he says right before that. I think the most interesting women sexually are the English women. I feel that the English women, the Swedes, the Northern Germans, and Scandinavians are a great deal more exciting than the Latin, the Italian, and the French women. Sex should not be advertised. Most of Alfred Hitchcock's female supporting characters are brunettes, redheads, or if they are blonde, their hair will almost certainly be dyed a darker shade than the leads. As a result, Hitchcock's non-blondes constitute a far more diverse and, to me, interesting group than his blondes. Nevertheless, I'd argue it's possible to organize them into three categories. The non-blonde leads, like Shirley MacLaine in The Trouble with Harry, Sylvia Sidney in Sabotage, Jane Wyman in Stage Fright, etc. The character actors, Thelma Ritter in Rear Window, Judith Anderson in Rebecca, and the rivals, Suzanne Pleshette in The Birds, Diane Baker in Marnie, etc. Obviously, these characters vary greatly from person to person, but there are some common threads that connect these groups. Where Hitchcock depicts his blondes as wealthy and worldly, as Walker points out, his brunettes are often members of the working class or tied to a domestic space. Where Melanie is a socialite living off her father's money in The Birds, Annie, is a teacher. Margaret Leighton plays a housekeeper to Ingrid Bergman's aristocrat in Under Capricorn. Judith Anderson as Mrs. Danvers runs the Manderley estate in Rebecca. Thelma Ritter tends to the injured Jimmy Stewart as Stella in Rear Window. And even in a chamber drama like Rear Window, Hitchcock finds clever ways to accentuate class differences in his female characters. All credit to John Michael Hayes' truly perfect screenplay. Lisa, the blonde, beautiful girlfriend, brings Jeff a lobster dinner from the trendy 21 Club. Stella, the brunette domestic employee, makes him a modest lunch of coffee and a sandwich. Character actors often play these roles, meaning that although the characters share an economic class, this category varies greatly in characterization. Stella, one of my favorite Hitchcock characters, has the same folksy charm and wit we see in many of Ritter's best-remembered roles, while Anderson is menacing as the manipulative Mrs. Danvers, anchored to the home less like a family member and more like a ghost, while Mildred Natwick makes a merry homemaker in The Trouble with Harry, offering blueberry muffins to neighbors and hoping that a romantic life is not yet closed off to her. While Hitchcock tends to portray his blondes as unknowable or mysterious and therefore intriguing, his brunettes often make themselves entirely available and therefore sexually uninteresting to his male protagonists. This is especially true for the rivals, supporting characters who patiently wait for the male protagonist's romantic attention, only to lose out to the blonde lead in the end. At least two of them tell the male lead directly to his face that they love him. In Marnie, Diane Baker plays Lil, the sister of Mark's late wife, who lives with him at his estate. She's in love with him and views Marnie as an intruder who might disrupt her plans to marry Mark herself. How dare Mark fall for Marnie when she had been there all along? She goes to great lengths to discover Marnie's secrets in an effort to expose her as a fraud.
I mean, if you are in some kind of trouble, I have absolutely no scruples. I'd lie to the police or anything.
Mark clearly sees her more like little sister. While Lil is wealthy and seemingly a member of the idle rich, she is nevertheless trapped by her home and domesticity. Upon Marnie's first visit to the estate, Mark entertains her by bringing her to his stable. Wanting to be alone, he insists Lil stay with his father. They'll have all the fun, while she is consigned to a service role.
Lil, I'm sure your sturdy young wrist has recovered sufficiently to pour Dad another cup of tea.
Midge from Vertigo, played by Barbara Bel Geddes, may technically be a blonde, but she functions like the quintessential Hitchcock brunette. Midge is a working woman. Early in the film, we see Jimmy Stewart at her humble apartment, chatting with her while she sketches a new bra design.
Revolutionary uplift. No shoulder straps and no back straps, but does everything a brassiere should do. Works on the principle of the cantilever bridge.
To me, this scene is a genius encapsulation of how the blonde-brunette dynamic functions within a Hitchcock film. In discussing a bra this way, Midge has taken the mystique and allure out of an erotic object by showing it for what it really is, a functional, practical garment. Midge offers no illusions or fantasies, something Madeline offers in spades. Later, we see Midge console and care for Stewart, and rather than see her as a potential mate, she becomes a maternal figure, domesticized, and therefore unalluring in his eyes. Justice for Midge, honestly, what a queen. This is the funniest moment in a Hitchcock film. He never knew what he had. You deserve better, Midge. He's a freak. Hitchcock's non-blonde leads tend to inhabit less glamorous worlds than his blondes as well. In Sabotage, Sylvia Sidney and her character's husband own a movie theater that caters primarily to the working class. When she's taken to a nice restaurant, she indicates that she's never been able to afford a meal at such an establishment.
All this is very expensive, isn't it?
In Stage Fright, Jane Wyman plays a drama student who is overtly framed as ordinary in comparison to the diva played by the blonde Marlene Dietrich. At one point, she cosplays the Help as part of a murder investigation. Let's just say one person on this set was going to get all of the glamour, and her name was not Jane Wyman.
Now get me out of these weeds. I'm beginning to feel sad, and I shouldn't feel sad. It's so depressing.
Shirley MacLaine's screen debut in The Trouble with Harry casts her in a dreamy domestic atmosphere, a small town in Vermont where the residents discover a dead body and debate amongst themselves what must have happened to him. This is one of Hitchcock's few comedies, although it's a characteristically dark one. And McClane's Jennifer, in turn, escapes the suffering Hitchcock's leads typically experience. She's not shot at, threatened, held hostage, or even attacked by an animal. Teresa Wright personifies the sympathetic, non-glamorous brunette in Shadow of a Doubt. Wright had become the go-to actress for the sweet girl next door in prestige dramas in the 1940s, and Hitchcock cast her in kind. As Photoplay put it upon the release of the film, she's not gorgeous like a Petty Peach or voluptuous a la Venus. She's just a pretty, dainty, typical American girl. Alida Valli in the Paradine case is probably the closest a brunette comes to playing the blonde archetype as an enigmatic woman who is accused of murder.
It will not shock you, I assume, to learn that I am a woman. What would you say? A woman who has seen a great deal of life.
But perhaps unsurprisingly, Hitchcock never actually wanted her in that role in the first place. He told Truffaut, unfortunately, Selznick had already signed up Alida Valli. He thought she was going to be another Bergman, so I had to use her, and this miscasting was very detrimental to the story. And to Hitchcock's point, this film really would have benefited from Ingrid Bergman. Later in his career, Hitchcock experiments with putting the blonde-brunette dynamic within the same character, adding new dimensions to these archetypes. At the beginning of Marnie, we're introduced to a black-haired woman making her escape. She's just robbed her most recent employer and returns to her hotel room to abandon her disguise. She puts aside the fraudulent ID for Marion Holland and washes the black dye out of her hair. Hair color, we come to learn, is Marnie's primary disguise as she moves from job to job stealing money. She doesn't change her wardrobe, she doesn't wear prosthetics, she just dyes her hair. When she becomes herself again, she returns to blonde. And yet, is that the true Marnie? When she returns to her childhood home to visit her mother suggests that this blonde isn't exactly natural either.
I see that you've lighted up your hair, Marnie.
A little.
Marnie may be a Hitchcock blonde, but this one doesn't actually know who she is. She's on the run from the law, from herself, from her past. Marnie's blondness, unique from the other Hitchcock blondes, is revealed as just another one of her ruses, an illusion. She may have grown up in poverty, but as an adult woman who has come into money, the kind of woman who can afford her own horse, she lightens her hair to play that role. Vertigo also explicitly conceives of blondness as an illusion. As you most likely already know, Jimmy Stewart plays an ex-police officer who is hired to follow an old friend's wife to monitor her declining mental health and to explore potential supernatural connections. Madeline is the fantasy Hitchcock blonde. Her platinum tresses are woven into a bun, symbolizing the tightly woven repression Stewart must untangle as part of the mystery. She sports a stunningly muted, tailored wardrobe. Novak has spoken in the past about how she didn't like wearing that iconic gray suit because it made her uncomfortable, but that in hindsight, she realized how right it was for the character.
It was right for her to wear it because it made her uncomfortable. It was right that she looked tormented by being it. It made her feel out of place. Something was wrong. You could tell that. He could tell it.
Madeline is also withholding. Admissions or confessions are hard fought. And Novak plays her with restraint, speaking in melodious, low tones as she wistfully looks into the distance. And yet, as the film continues, Madeline is revealed to have been a lie. In reality, Judy was hired to play Madeline as part of a murderous scheme. She is not the unknowable blonde, but a regular brunette, who reads decidedly lower class than Madeline. Her makeup is overdone, her jewelry gaudy, her clothes more outrageous colors with far less elegant tailoring, the opposite of garments Head describes Hitchcock wanting for his leads. Her days aren't spent wandering at museums or picking out flowers, but at work. Novak's delivery as Judy is much more naturalistic and animated. She uses slang.
I suddenly felt such a fool.
Well, I wanted to drive you home. Are you all right?
Oh, yes. Yes, I'm fine. No after effects. Like me?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the best you can do?
Come here.
Oh, no. You'll muss me.
This is a real woman, but Stewart cannot let go of his memory of Madeline. There's no shortage of interpretations of Vertigo as a film. There are a million ways to unpack it. But for the purposes of this essay, I find the potential autobiographical components most compelling. Stewart plays a man enchanted by an unreal woman who becomes so obsessed with the image that he must resurrect her from the dead. Walker writes, Madeline is Novak as glamorous movie star, and the very fact that the film foregrounds the process of construction in building up her image is also a comment on the operation of the star system, the manufacturing of the female star to satisfy male fantasies. It is only to be expected that Madeline remains ungraspable, elusive. Novak herself would appear to agree with this analysis, having spoken extensively about how she saw herself and Hitchcock represented in the film.
I think the role appealed to me because it was the resistance of Judy, who was, in a sense, me, trying to become the Hollywood person, trying to be Madeline, needing to be loved and willing to be made over. And I remember when I played it, I felt absolutely stripped naked, you know. I felt so vulnerable. The facade was everything to him. If the hair was off in any way, he was calling the hairdresser over constantly. Fix that. In the back, the bun is twisted wrong. And he would notice that. He was obsessed with it, I would say. Obsessed with the look. It was as if he was Jimmy Stewart making sure that she was dressed exactly the way Madeline was. He was playing the part of Jimmy Stewart.
The desire to mold a star to his own fantasies took frightening turns in real life, too. Perhaps the greatest example of this comes from the story of Tippi Hedren. Plucked from obscurity by Hitchcock, who saw her in a commercial.
Feel better. Feel younger. Have the figure you want. See the pounds go. With Seago. With Seago.
He went about the process of turning this relative unknown into his idea of the Hitchcock blonde. But her experience of star making was far from a Hollywood fairy tale. Watch any interview with Hedren, and you'll understand that Hitchcock blondes sometimes suffered off-screen as much as they did on-screen.
I don't know if any of you women have had the horrible experience of being the object of someone's obsession. If you have, you would know exactly what that is like, and it is oppressive and frightening. And you find out that you've been followed, and you find out that your handwriting has been analyzed, and you find out that you're being spied upon. It was at that time when he made the demands on me that were just so offensive to me that it was right then and there that I stopped all of it. I just said, I am not going any further with this. When Marnie is over, I am going to be out of this contract. He said, I'll ruin your career. I said, do what you have to do. I'm gone. And he did. He did ruin my career. He kept paying me my $600 a week. And after I got out of the Birds and Marnie, I was, as the expression goes, a hot actress. And I would later learn how many directors and producers wanted me for their films, but in order to get me, they would have to go through him. And all he said, it was so easy. All he said was, she isn't available.
While researching this video, I kept coming back to this David Fincher quote in the 2015 documentary Hitchcock Truffaut.
If you think that you can hide what your prurient interests are, what your fascinations are, if you think you can hide that in your work as a film director, you're nuts.
Hitchcock was an exacting director, a master of suspense, and like many of his characters, deeply flawed. Important to keep in mind as we analyze these films. Obviously, I didn't cover every Hitchcock blonde and brunette and redhead and whatever else in between hair color in this video, but let me know in the comments who your favorite Hitchcock character is, and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Thank you again to Mubi for sponsoring this video. Mubi is a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. It's like your own personal film festival, streaming anytime, anywhere. As I've said before, Mubi is an essential streaming service for cinephiles. Their selections are handpicked by curators who want to surface unique, interesting things, not just whatever that you can keep on in the background while you do something else. On Mubi, you'll find things like Grand Theft Hamlet, Shakespeare filmed entirely in the virtual chaos of Grand Theft Auto, The Fall, a cult classic that rarely streams anywhere. And who could forget The Substance, which might just win some big awards at the Oscars this year. Mubi is interested in film culture as a whole, which is why I also want to talk about Notebook. Notebook is a print-only magazine devoted to the art and culture of cinema, created, prepared, and published by Mubi. Each issue comes with an exclusive gift, a surprise just for subscribers, and shipping is free wherever you are. Issue 6 of Notebook, titled In the Moment of Match Strike, is devoted to different expressions of youth on film, exploring what it means to be young in cinema, manifestations of youth culture, and how artists look back at their younger selves. My favorite part of this issue was this conversation between Karen Disher, Tracy Grandstaff, and Wendy Hoops, key figures in the making of Daria, a representation of youth on screen that I definitely appreciated growing up. I'm obviously a fan, but didn't really know very much about how the show was developed, so that conversation was really enlightening to me. And hey, talk about a brunette-blonde dynamic. Issue 6 is available via subscription and in select stores around the world. Subscriptions cost $40 for 2 issues annually. You can find out more about Notebook at mubi.com/magazine, and don't forget to check the link in my bio for a whole month of great cinema free on Mubi.